Grounded Teaching is produced by Regenerative Ed. This is episode 2 of our Patterns and Biomimicry series. Last week was simply the introduction podcast about what we're doing here in the series, but it's a really good place to head back to if you haven't listened to it yet. Today is our first episode that digs into pattern number 1 that we see in natural systems that we're going to be talking about, which is spirals. And as a kickoff to this episode, I want to offer a quick reminder as to why we're talking about patterns and natural systems. You know, we are steeped in industrial systems in our culture, and I'm talking about mainly Western culture here. We are looking to unlearn those Western patriarchal, capitalistic, mechanical, industrial paradigms as a way of operating. I know there's a lot of buzzwords there, but that mode, all of those things cause really extraction and separation. And so if we see these places where we have sort of this industrial mindset, for example, we're prizing, let's say, quantity over quality. And if we see that, we can think, okay, instead of using this industrial system solution of trying to get more and more and more quantity over quality, like that linear thinking for a faster pace, for example, maybe we can think we have an alternative. We can look to how natural systems doing it, and in doing so, here's my claim. Okay, we're going to undoubtedly create more life, more connection, more beauty, more gratitude, and the stuff that makes us really feel alive. And okay, maybe you're saying, oh, how can you be so sure? Well, I mean, one thing, and we're going to get into a lot of it today, but how do you just feel when you look at the spiral on a snail shell? Like if you really look at it, I mean, there's a sense of wonder, at least inside me, I'll speak for myself, that moves inside of me. And that's kind of how I can be so sure that these things are for real, right? There's eons of wisdom and knowing there that have created life with so much beauty using these patterns. And I'm alive, and I'm trusting that I can know that and remember those patterns, and that those patterns will bring more life. So that's my thesis, right? Not just me, but many biomimicry experts that exist in the world, okay? So, there's also, if you want a little bit more, and I did link it in our workbook, there's an article in The Atlantic that says how the human brain recognizes these fractal patterns automatically and feels really comfortable with them. And I'll talk a little bit more about fractal patterns when we get into branching in a couple of episodes and that sort of thing. But as we go along, with the next 8 podcast episodes in the series on patterns and biomimicry, we're obviously only going to be scratching the surface here because there's so much to talk about. And we want to engage you in our free community on Mighty Networks, because this is sort of, podcast is sort of like a one-way deal here. And I would love for this to be more interactive. So the Mighty Networks is a Facebook page, but it's a lot better than a Facebook page. It's a place where you can post your reactions to this content. You could, connect with other folks who are interested in regenerative ed and listen to this podcast too. We're also going to run a free Zoom call about halfway through this series to chat about biomimicry in our design, in our lives, in our ed system, and our roles in ed. So, if you sign up, you'll be able to participate in that. Oh, and also, we created a downloadable workbook to go along with this series. And in the workbook, we have some extended information, like in the spiral section for today's podcast. We have a few extra examples that are related to teaching. We have some embodiment exercises related to spirals, some questions to consider as you're planning your own stuff, right? A resource list and that sort of thing. And each episode has a section in that workbook. And as I mentioned last week, we're experimenting with putting something that we'd usually run as a workshop on like a Zoom call sort of deal. We're putting that on a podcast in order to be more accessible for folks. And we often do workbooks to go along with the workshop. So there you go. You can download the workbook at groundedteaching.com/patterns. And right now the workbook only goes up through the section of spirals. And then each section of the workbook will be released with each podcast episode. And at the end, we'll collate it all for you in one PDF if you're listening to this after they've all been released. Yeah. So again, if you want that, that's on our website, groundedteaching.com/patterns. Okay. So then one more final thing before we get into the meat of talking about spirals. Quick note to say thank you so much for your support over the last 2 years. We've been really reflecting on the future of regenerative ed and grounded teaching, and just feel so lucky to have this podcasting experiment. And the reciprocation from you all for subscribing and, leaving reviews and especially sending messages to me and saying what resonates with you, it's had a really great impact on my life. And if you've, it just means a lot to hear that. And I just wanted to say thank you so much for that. And if you've joined our free Mighty Networks group from after listening to this podcast, welcome. I also want to give a really huge special thanks to 4 folks who have been generously contributing their funds to this work through our Patreon for some time now. That's Susan, Nelisa, Stacy, and of course my mother. Our mother, Jess and mine's mom. Thank you so much from the bottom of our hearts. And if you're a past supporter, thank you so much too. Or you come to our workshops, thank you so much. And as we think about really the sustainability of this podcast for this upcoming year, we do have a couple of goals. One goal is to cover our recurring platform costs by the end of March. And that monthly total is about $250 a month. We're currently at $49 a month with our Patreon supporters. That's covered by those 4 individuals. And I know that our listenership is way larger than that. So if this podcast has really meant something to you, and if you have a few extra bucks lying around each month, our first goal is to just cover our platform costs each month. And that's $250. And it would feel really supportive to be able to cover those costs with recurring Patreons as a starting point for making this podcast more sustainable. And then after we hit that $250 mark and we get our expenses covered, maybe we could talk about growth, but that's our first goal. You can hit us up on Patreon/regenerative and the first tier starts at $3. Thank you so much. Okay, so we talked about Mighty Networks, we talked about the workbook, we talked about Patreon. I think we're covered with that, and we are now going to get into spirals. If you're not driving or multitasking like I usually am whenever I listen to podcasts, and you want to, open up the workbook, download it, print it out, go for it. That's really, really cool. It's there for you to organize and supplement your thinking later. And if not, print it out when you're done. So, okay, enough of that, enough chit chat. This doesn't really even feel like an intro anymore. We're at like 8 minutes in, but appreciate you all. And let's get on with spirals. Hey everyone. Woohoo! I know that we are in calendar year 3 of the pandemic and whatnot. And on a micro level, I, like most other humans in this time, still have little moments of the world falling sort of apart and, thinking, what's the point? But ultimately and quite deeply, I'd say I am increasingly, especially filled with so much love and hope. And I wonder if you're feeling that way too. And I also want to recognize that it is a painful time out there. Systems are basically eating themselves alive, which really is a sign of the end times. I think of the ends of these systems is what I mean by the end times. The health system creating non-health, the educational system dumbing itself down and standardizing itself in order to educate, the agricultural system of growing food, destroying the soil in which food is grown in order to grow food. So these are, examples of last ditch efforts for these systems to stay alive. And it feels, it's hard. And I think that we're in the pains of that sort of death of the old way of doing things. And then there's this composting that's required in order for new systems to be born. But that cycle of composting is what really is keeping me hopeful these days. So if you're feeling all that, maybe some pain, some joy, some hope, you're in the right place. You're in good company. And today we're specifically talking about appreciating beauty right now in life today, which, that alone gives me a lot of peace. And so yeah, let's get into it. Spirals. I am so excited to talk about spirals today. They are obviously, they're cool. They're how you draw eyes when you're drawing a cartoon face that's hypnotized, right? So they've got some sort of power there. But in all seriousness, if you look at a spiral in nature, like a nautilus shell, it's pretty hypnotizing. It's that perfect ratio of a Fibonacci sequence. It's straight up it's beautiful. It is captivating and it's beautiful. And it's really no wonder that so many cultures have something sacred about a spiral, like dating way back in history. And that is something that I really don't want to shortchange as we start to get into design application today. So if you take the time to pause and appreciate those spirals, you're going to fall into a sense of wonder about the beauty of it, right? So if all you do after listening to this podcast is just marvel in that beauty, I really feel like my work here is done. I've been able to do that a lot more this week in focusing on writing this podcast, and it's just been really helpful to me. Maybe you're thinking, it's not just enough to appreciate the beauty. You got to get to the action, have to do the thing with it, right? Design something with it. And we will, but also, and this has been a real challenge for myself to try to avoid the need to really do something with the understanding of a spiral. Do something about it. Maybe you can join me in challenging yourself to consider that. I wonder if all I did was appreciate the beauty and become more connected to the natural patterns that exist all around me, that maybe that would actually change how I move in the world. And it wouldn't be as linearly or as, cognitively as, okay, I understand this design application, now let's design it, right? But simply because I'm more connected, there would be some sort of shift. So while we're going to get into application and let's say, design action, you can call it, with cognitive knowledge that we're going to gain here today, please understand that the initial action is to simply sit back and observe the geometrical beauty that exists all around us, to the point that it really can move us so deeply. And so much will come from just that connection. I promise that we can't really put into words or design with cognitive knowing. Okay. So that's your challenge today. If you're like someone who's like, I want to jump to action like me. Okay. That's the challenge. I'm working on it. That's sort of my practice for this series, is to just appreciate. Now, that said, if you haven't spent any time observing spirals before, I'm encouraging you to simply pause the podcast if you're at a place where you can, and spend at least 30 seconds really just observing the picture of, there's a few on our workbook, the snail shell, the spiral patterns at the top corner of all the pages. Or, what you could even do right now is clench your fist and then look directly at it from the side. You know how you used to draw a face on your hand in maybe in elementary school, or maybe more recently if you're like me. You draw a face and then there's like the mouth and stuff. But look at that shape that your fist has created. That's a spiral there, right? If you focus on it, it's really unbelievable, the mathematical sacred geometry in that form. And we humans have created a system of understanding these patterns, and we call it math in part. And there's some really fascinating things about fractals and Fibonacci sequences. I already mentioned Fibonacci that we're going to touch on throughout this series. And if those words are foreign to you, it's worth checking out the resources that I linked in the workbook pages. We're going to get into fractals more in our upcoming podcast on branching patterns, but please read about the Fibonacci spiral. Basically, there's a mathematical pattern of ratios that exists, and it's a phenomenon, and it forms just really beautiful spirals and ratios in nature. For example, sunflower heads and the way that the seeds are arranged, and, snail shells. And, one of the things that comes to mind for me when I think about a snail building this snail shell home is like, wow, how did a snail know how to do that? Because we think about things so cognitively, right? Like as if we were building it. And one thing I keep thinking is just because that is a sacred knowing, it's something that we can try to cognitively explain, right? But there is also just something in this world, in these natural patterns, that just, it does that, right? And so we can recognize that as maybe, we can understand it through theories and stuff like Fibonacci sequencing and that sort of thing, but also just really recognize the mystery and the wonder and the beauty there. And like I said in the intro, The Atlantic, and I linked it in the workbook pages, has a really great written piece on why our eyes recognize fractal relationships like spirals in nature. It's fascinating. We're drawn to it, but that kind of shows that we have this knowing for this stuff, this remembering of this stuff, like a connection to these patterns. And at some level, we get it. And if we were to slow down to appreciate that, it could really help connect us. And so that Atlantic article and some other research that I found really tries to explain why humans are drawn to those fractal patterns, which is cool. But I also think it's fine to just understand that when we see fractal patterns like a Fibonacci spiral and branches and waves that we're going to talk about, and we just see it and recognize it and appreciate it, there's no one that had to teach us how to appreciate that. We see it and we know it, right? And that is just this connection, this knowing that I want us to get closer to throughout this series. So again, one lesson that I'm continuously being taught over and over: don't instantly jump to doing, right? Just observing the beauty can be the thing. And the bonus is the next step of design action that we're taking. And so as we observe the beauty of the spiral that we just sort of understand as living creatures, we're going to appreciate the functions as well. And so the function is going to make up the rest of this podcast. That's the biomimicry piece. And as an English teacher, we got bio, which means life, mimic means imitate, biomimicry is, imitating life. That's what we're trying to do with the systems that we're in charge of designing, is use them to try to create systems that support life, not extract from them. So to do that, I'm going to go through a few examples here of spirals, of which there are millions more, but I'm just going to touch on 4. Okay. We can appreciate them. We'll better understand their function. Why spirals? Why should we think about spirals? And then we're going to see how we can apply those functions in elements of our lives to create systems in our lives that create more life. Got it? Okay. Now, since this isn't a podcast necessarily for architects, though, I'm sure you would, if you're an architect, that would be great. You've probably already thought about, how to design based on systems and patterns that you see in nature. But since most of us aren't, we're going to stretch our brains and move beyond concrete shapes, as in, I don't just want us thinking, oh, a spiral is a protective shape. I should design a protective building or a protective room setup with my desks in my classroom where the most important thing is on the inside. We're not talking so much about physical objects. We might talk a little bit about that. But most of the problems that we're designing for are not actually physical moving around a building sort of things, like a classroom layout. A good bit of what we're going to get into have to do with social structures or emotional spirals. That's what we're going to be talking about today. So to sum up, there are 2 purposes of this pod. Purpose 1 is that you leave this podcast simply being more aware of the pattern of a spiral and observe its beauty and elegance and purpose. And then purpose 2 is to understand the function of a pattern so that we can utilize it if we might need that function in a system in our lives. And you'll start to understand as we get rolling here. So we're going to dig into 4 examples of spirals that we see in natural systems, and we'll be starting here with concrete, actual physical spirals so that the symbolism and the application is really clear. So example number 1. Last summer, I was walking through the park with my friend. We saw a big brown snake near the trail, all coiled up. And as much as I am now appreciating snakes, I still, definitely did one of those, right? Ooh. But the point is that the snake was all coiled up for a reason. And it was sort of in the shape of a spiral, a clumpy spiral, but a spiral nonetheless. And I was curious about what that spiral meant. And I could have guessed, but I looked it up just to be sure. And most experts agree that the main reason that snakes do that is for protection, why they don't just always stay long, right? When a snake's curled up, it's less likely to get snagged by a predator that could normally just grab it by its tail. Okay, so function 1 of a spiral in a pattern that we see in natural systems is protection. And if you want a little bit more cognitive, a bigger cognitive exercise here, you can pause this podcast and just think about what other spirals do you see in natural systems that offer protection. So if I'm thinking about it, snails go deep into their shells when they want protection, right? That offers some sort of protection. There's this long route to go from the outside opening to get to the center of something. And it's clear how that shape can offer protection. Also, let's say that if we want to hold on to something small so that we don't lose it, let's say I have a diamond ring in my hand or something, right? I would grab it in my fist and put my fingers over it and then fold my thumb over my fingers to sort of form that spiral, that protection of that thing. Okay? So function number 1 of spirals, aside from our, most important base function of being beautiful and captivating and hypnotizing, function 1 is protection. Okay, so let's observe other examples of spirals and see what else we find. And this is a thought process that you can go through when you see a pattern in a natural system as well. In my garden, I see a spiral. It's a snap pea, and it's a tendril that's wrapping its way around the trellis. And it really just floors me how strong those tendrils are, that they look so tiny, but they can keep up these big plants. They're super strong. So I'm thinking strength, right? This would be my thought process. Let me see if there are other examples of spirals that offer strength. Well, go back to our snakes. My 5-year-old would tell me about this prehistoric snake called the Titanoboa, one of his favorites, but really any boa constrictor would spiral around its prey to, crush them with their strength. That fist that we talked about before, right? It's how we make our hands stronger to use it for something that might require strength, like pounding or punching, right? So spirals offer strength. So now we've got protection as our first function. We've got strength as our second function. And again, as a reminder, we also have absolutely hypnotizing beauty, right? Okay, what else? Well, let's look at a fiddlehead fern that's all curled up in springtime. It is for protection and it is for strength, but it's also for efficiency of nutrients and resources. Think about when we're cold and we want to preserve heat. We curl up into as spirally as a spiral as we can get, right? We save that heat energy. We have efficiency. And, also to boot, spirals stack a hell of a lot of circumference into one small area. So that's that efficiency of space. Humans have, of course, noted this in a lot of our design work. And if we want to solve a problem of efficient space to, let's say, get upstairs, one great solution is a spiral staircase, right? That's efficiency. So now we have 3 things. We have protection, we have strength, we have efficiency, and of course, we have our, base purpose of just beauty, right? All right, so then the fourth thing that we're going to talk about, the final function that we'll talk about here amidst many functions of a spiral, is present in not just the snail's shell, but in the act of building the snail's spiral shell, in the act of creating any spiral, really. At the beginning of the workbook for this section, if you were able to start with the workbook, I asked you to draw a spiral. And if you didn't draw one yet, draw one with your mind right now, or kind of trace your finger wherever you are. Where do you start when you draw a spiral? Do you start from the outside in or the inside out? Likely you'd start from the center and move outwards. And it's the same thing with snails who build their spiral shells. They start from the inside point of the shell and then they expand out as they grow. And when you go to build a spiral, you don't start from the outside and work your way in. And this is actually my favorite feature of spirals, which is expansion. Expansion. They offer an opportunity, spirals, to swing back around at a similar point, but after you've grown out a little bit more, after you've matured a little bit, right? Maybe you're looking at that same viewpoint, but now you have an elevated or a bigger picture understanding. There's so much to dig into here. So, okay, let's see now where these 4 functions that we're focusing on here today, so protection, strength, efficiency, and expansion, could show up in living systems design of our personal and work life. Okay, you ready? So what we're going to do now is act as living system designers around some of the social, emotional, and physical systems in our life that are, maybe crying out for a solution that a spiral can offer. And we've talked about 4: protection, strength, efficiency, and expansion. So scenario number 1, where we see a problem that could require strength, efficiency, expansion, or protection. And this pattern, coincidentally, is actually a spiral in and of itself. This pattern is called a quote-unquote bad day. I will share with you a recent bad day pattern that happened on Saturday. Saturdays are supposed to be good days, right? But I woke up with a super stiff neck, the kind where you sort of have to, turn your whole body when someone calls your name. So I woke up with that. And then my kid, jumped on me to say good morning, and it hurt. I know if you listened to the last one, he also recently knocked my tooth out. He's really a sweet kid. I'm not trying to say that he always jumps on me, whatever. But it did hurt. It hurt because my neck was stiff, right? Okay, and then I thought, oh man, there goes my productivity today, because I had planned to do a few physical things like work out. I planned to rip out wallpaper out of one of our rooms that we're redoing. And that might not sound like a good day to you, right? But to each his own. I really had these plans to do this. And so I go downstairs. My partner reminds me that he's going into work today, which I'd totally forgotten about. And now instead of this fun, full family day of like doing things, getting things done, having fun together. Now I'm thinking about being really alone with a 5-year-old with a fairly mobile body as I look in the fridge and I'm remembering that we have no creamer for coffee. So these things are just stacking up. Now, obviously, on the scale of bad days, I recognize that this is mild. But isn't this how the majority of us start what we call, quote unquote, bad days? I'm not talking about calamity days. I'm just talking about a run of the mill. I had a bad day, right? Bad days themselves are spirals. And we often call them a downward spiral, right? Which is interesting because remember what we know about spirals. They're really strong. They protect. And in this case, I'm protecting my idea that today is a bad day. Am I not? Like I've started that narrative in my head and now I'm going to protect it. And there's a lot of strength around the protection of this bad day idea. And that's why it's so hard to pull yourself out of a spiral. It's a strong force. We've talked about the strength there. We've talked about the protection. And it strengthens as it grows. Think of a hurricane. So as we can see, the actual forces of a spiral, strength and protection, are neutral, but sometimes they can protect something that maybe isn't serving us anymore. In this case, the idea that I'm having a bad day with one proof point building on the next in this sort of downward spiral, right? So I've recognized that I can fall into the bad day downward spiral. Now for the metaphorical biomimicry, right? I see that this is an issue in my life that I'd rather not have bad days. I'd rather not be subject to them, right? And I want to design a tendency for an upward spiral, perhaps, in my life. So what might be a quality that I need in order to not have these downward spirals, not to let them get a hold of me? Well, coincidentally, because we're talking about a downward spiral, I would need strength to combat the other strength of the downward spiral, right? And what offers strength? Well, another spiral, actually. So let's not talk just yet about how to pull myself out of that bad day, but rather let's talk about how to start my morning so that the trajectory is building an upward spiral instead of a downward one. Because just like when a snail starts building its shell, it starts small, and then it builds on the strength of that smaller inside to move outward. And that's what I need. I need a new center point that I acknowledge as a center of an upward spiral that I can see as my morning or my whole day or as a fractal of my life, really. And likely that starts off with a super tiny habit that I can introduce in my morning. And thousands of books have been written about morning routines for good reason. They really do set your day in the right motion. But I like taking it a step further, and instead of just seeing it as a good start to a linear day, right? I think of it as a snail building its shell around a strong center and then expanding upwards and outwards throughout the day. And, maybe that's just looking at my face while I'm brushing my teeth and marveling at the intricacy of, a part of my face in the reflection. Or maybe, and this is what I actually do, before getting out of bed, making a practice of visualizing something that lights me up. And then that's the center of my growth and expansion for the next hour, then the morning, then the whole day. Okay. And I'm learning this, I'm practicing this. So now, of course, this is not all rainbows. What if I still wake up with a literal pain in my neck? I need to be prepared. Is this where I spiritually bypass the whole thing? Like, oh, thank you for my neck pain because it means I have a neck. I mean, yeah, if that feels authentic to you, then go for it, for sure. But for me, it's probably more like, shit, neck pain. Ugh, right? Deep breath, feet hit the floor, and then a routine. I'm going to be my best version of myself today with loads of love. And then that becomes my center point. The neck pain is a detail, but it's not going to be the center of a downward spiral, right? I'm choosing a different center. So we can, maybe you're seeing how using the spiral is a little more convincing and helpful than simply saying to yourself, be positive, be grateful for what you have, do a mantra, right? This sort of gives us the strength and the visual concept of taking that step towards expansion because we've taken the first step towards expansion. So, okay, if you look at your fist again, right, spirals offer strength and grip, but sometimes we may be gripping onto something that doesn't serve us anymore. And, where might that be? What's in your fist? I don't know. You can jot it in your workbook. For example, maybe we're protecting the idea that we're not worthy if we're not busy. Ding, ding, ding. That one hit home for me for a very long time. Or maybe we're protecting some sort of shame that we're feeling about something. Now, clearly, I am not any sort of therapist, and this is not that sort of advice, but it's been really helpful for me, and I'll just share my story, to think about not just releasing these ideas like, bam, right? Now they've been released, okay? It's that easy. Because if we think about spirals, and if we think that, okay, these ideas are protected, maybe they're inside of a spiral, right? If they are so protected, maybe it's more of an unwinding of my fingers or of any sort of spiral that I do. And so since I've been thinking a lot about this in the past week, and in my meditations, I've been actually picturing an unraveling of some of these thoughts that don't serve me about my worth. And so I've pictured them sort of as the core that is like maybe inside of my hand. This is like one that I've been visualizing, right? So I have this idea that doesn't serve me anymore inside of my grip, and then I'm slowly just peeling back the thumb first until like my thumb is free, and then I can slowly peel back my fingers. I also visualize, a yo-yo that was wound up really tight, and then I released the yo-yo and it hit the bottom. You know how it does that like jog when it hits the bottom? That like knocked my idea out of it. I don't know. Be creative, right? That's the beautiful thing about being a human, is like, think about what visualizations when you're winding and unwinding, like how might that help you? And then, meditate on it. Those are just some personal ideas. Okay, so those are some personal ideas, but here's an example of a spiral in a social dynamic. Since most of us listening are in a position where we may be in charge of some sort of social dynamic, like let's say we're in front of a classroom or we're leading a PTA meeting with a group of parents or something, and things just start to really spiral downwards, right? The meeting gets away from us. The classroom where kids, they're just starting to lose it, right? We've all been there. I've been there, especially my first few years of teaching. And there are a few times that I was just frozen because I didn't actually really know what to do. So when that sort of social spiral happens, it's really hard to pull out of. And the best thing to do, of course, is just like what we talked about before, where we're aware enough to know that such a spiral could occur, and that we want out of it. There are some spirals that can be super destructive, like tornadoes or hurricanes, and we don't want to get sucked in. So what we need to do is build the infrastructure that can be resilient to those things. So maybe we have a norm that folks write down their questions first before vocalizing their disagreements in these meetings. Or maybe we have a specific time at the end of the meeting where we can share our thinking in an organized manner. Or maybe we send out a Google form before the PTA meeting to get everyone's concerns up front so that we can be prepared to address them ahead of time. These are sort of the concrete infrastructure pillars that we design knowing how destructive a hurricane can be, right? And, sometimes if we're in it, honestly, the best thing to do is just sort of stand in the doorframe with this sense of calm, right? Like you can find the eye of it. And then when we emerge from the doorframe and everything is destroyed, we can say, okay, now what? And, we learn the lessons and we come forward. And that's kind of what we have to do. I recently learned that in Cuba, when a hurricane is coming, the electricians themselves in the town often go and they just take down the power lines preemptively. Why do they do this? Well, it's their small town. They want to have power after the hurricane. So it's better to take it down preemptively without having to fix the destruction afterwards. So same thing here. What infrastructure or actions can you preemptively take if the forecast is saying that it could look like a hurricane? And again, why are we looking at spirals as a design framework? Why do we care? Well, it's because we trust natural systems. We trust that they are more effective than mechanical systems. And when I say that, I mean things that are linear, standardized, unconscious, okay? So if you notice that there's an element of your life that is linear, standardized, unconscious, extractive, that is a place where we can look to inspiration from a natural system to make those areas more alive, more regenerative. And maybe it's not spirals. Maybe it's one of the next 7 patterns that we're going to look at. Or maybe it's not a pattern in nature, but it's something else that you have noticed that's regenerative in natural systems. Okay, here's the next example. This one is not a spiral in and of itself. Let's say I am the leader of some sort of team that has an initiative. Maybe I'm a department head or school leader or a PTA parent or a community project organizer, and I notice that as the leader, I have an idea that I would like to expand. And maybe I've hashed out this idea in other meetings. So I know it's a solid, seed of an idea, but now it's time to water the seed, so to speak, right? We want to expand it. But, the structure of my team really is pretty typical. And I've never actually really thought about it, let's say. And if I do think about it, it works like a 2 or 3 level, typical hierarchy, but I've really tried to incorporate movement of ideas between the hierarchy. So, it's usually me at the top facilitating meetings as lead organizer, sending out correspondence, and then it's everybody else who attends the meetings and shares their thinking. And we, I try to have a fairly collaborative atmosphere, asking for people to share their ideas, right? I don't want to come off like these are my ideas and, we want to co-create this, but maybe I'm noticing that we don't usually get very far with our collaboration. So for example, maybe I'll share an idea and then the entire team rips apart the idea or offers up all of their ideas that they've been thinking about. And then we run out of time for the meeting. So it's back to the drawing board because I'm not trying, to make these sweeping decisions for everybody. And then the same thing happens again. And it's like, if you think about the direction of the ideas, they're arrows pointing back and forth at each other, right? Back and forth, back and forth. And in some instances, this is good. If you're doing a big brainstorming session, the purpose is just to get all the ideas out, right? That would be what you want, right? But in some instances, this isn't necessarily efficient. And it also doesn't offer expansion. Often we're just talking about the same things over and over again. So I'm looking at the dynamics of my team and I'm noticing that I could use more expansion, more efficiency. And wow, what do you know? I remember that there is a pattern in nature that does this really well, which is spirals. So when I'm thinking about, setting up a team meeting, how does a spiral apply though? It seems like it seems strange. Well, let me just think about the interactions on the team, right? And if I could draw and I could map them, it would look like arrows going back and forth, right? But what if I were to point the arrows in the direction of a spiral, expanding outward? So that instead of me blurting out an idea to a whole team, or the team blurting out ideas to me, what if instead, let's say I have a team of 10 and I asked if there were, 2 other dedicated members of the team who'd like to form a triad at the core of the spiral with me, with a specific initiative. We create that core of the spiral. Then within that core, we can efficiently, since there's only 3 of us, really tease out the best ideas. Maybe we did a brainstorming session where all the ideas were aired before. And for this function, we are creating a spiral. And so we tease out those best ideas. We refine one to pass along to the next group for the next iteration. And then we start that expansion process with arrows pointing outward in the shape of a spiral. And then on the next level of the spiral out, we can think about the other folks in that loop of the spiral, and their job is to expand the idea, making it more true to service, more influential, and then they pass that on to the next folks. And then we have the last leg of the folks, and their job is to expand it further. Now, maybe you're saying, Sarah, what is the difference between this and simply doing iterative work? Why, where you go back and forth on drafts or whatnot? I don't really see much of a difference. Well, maybe you found that it's inefficient. And, because the directions, the arrows are pointing backwards at the original people. And that feedback maybe has this impact of almost us wanting to be really smart and coming up with a better idea than the initial one. And it kind of goes back and forth in this ego that's, this loop that you can get caught in that really isn't that efficient. And then we have to sort through which of those ideas are best. It's that arrow pointing back in. But if everyone sees, and I mean actually literally sees by way of you putting up a spiral on a whiteboard or something and saying, this is the direction that we're heading in for this specific initiative, for this specific project. This is how we're going to do our iterative work. Here's where you are in the spiral. Here's where you are in the spiral. And if they see their role is expanding the reach to its, to reach its purpose, that feedback will likely be more efficient and stronger. We're expanding outward, right? And we're keeping our eyes on the goal also. How often when we give feedback do we sort of lose the thread sometimes, right? But if we have that core and we keep expanding outwards, we're not going back and forth in the same iterative way. For some projects, for some ideas that we need to just expand, this may be a really good solution. So if you're a teacher, you could set up your group dynamics to function this way too during some group work if there's a specific point. And there's more on that in the workbook, a few details there. Then after you do this, if you practice this, sit back and see if that structural change actually created some more life, some more agency. My guess is that it will. Why? Well, because I've tried it with an organization that Jess and I run called Rust Belt Fibershed. But more than that, because we are mimicking a natural pattern that does those things. And I'm just going to go on a limb and say that our cognitive 21st century brains are probably not better designers than maybe some divine force that created the universe or that we can remember within us, or however you want to say it. Okay? So to recap it all, spirals are beautiful. First, marvel in that. Spend some time doing it. Notice that beyond beauty, We reviewed just 4 of the many functions of a spiral: strength, protection, efficiency, and expansion. We talked about using spirals to help us have strength in replacing downward spirals like bad days, in unwinding stories that we're gripping onto, and in creating infrastructure for meetings that we're leading, where we feel the barometer may be dropping a little bit. Then we talked a little bit about using a spiral as a structure as a way to consider iterative work. And all of this has a lot to do with simply visualizing that pattern and moving in that way socially and emotionally with keeping that in our mind's eye. There are a lot more applications of spirals in our lives. I put a few for teaching just specifically in the workbook. But what do you got? What do you have? Share them on our Instagram at Grounded Teaching or in our free community page on the Mighty Networks. The link is in our bio. And I hope that you've enjoyed this podcast. I had a blast preparing for spirals, and honestly, this probably could have been an entire series in and of itself. I had to cut a lot, but let me know, let me know what you think about this. Let me know how it's helpful, if it's helpful. Please reach out, and thank you all so much for listening here and for just, being an engaged member of our community. Our next episode is about waves, so stay tuned. Love y'all.